Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf contains two Mishnayos, and therefore three separate discussions. The first subject is that of setting up an Eruv in a place which is Tamei, and the potential concerns that are involved with that. Then comes the Mishnah, which discusses different types of food which is not halachically prepared properly, meaning it does not have the proper truma, meiser, or pidyon associated with it. And then the next Mishnah discusses who you're allowed to send an Eruv with, who can you trust to set up an Eruv for you properly. So first of all, the Gemara is discussing setting up an Eruv in a Tamei place. So the Gemara has brought, there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. Are you allowed to set up an Eruv made of truma food for a kohen in a Tamei place? Now there's two things discussed. There's one if it's in a cemetery, and the other is if it's just on a solitary grave, where you place the actual Eruv on the grave itself. So there's a number of concerns here. First of all, how is the kohen going to get to the truma? How's the kohen going to get to the Eruv if he has to become tamei in order to get there? The second thing is, how do you make the truma tamei by placing it in this tamei environment? There's a few different ways that it could become tamei. The Gemara will go through the concerns. The Gemara is going to want to try to figure out how do we end up with a machlokes on the subject. What is the issue that is not clear? That will prove to be a machlokes tanoim, but that's going to be problematic because it will be a statement in which you have a number of Amoraim that seem to go one way or another. We're going to have to try to figure out why those Amoraim are not falling on one side or another of a machlokas. Okay, so let's see this Gemara here. So the Gemara says as follows: you set up an Eruv in a cemetery or on a grave made of truma for a kohen. So the Rabbanan say it's no good because the kohen can't get there, and Rabbi Yehuda says that it's not a problem. So the Gemara asks, first of all, how's the kohen going to get there? He has to become tamei to get there. So the Gemara explains that he arrives there in a crate of some sort, which is designed in such a way that it blocks tumah, so it doesn't become tamei. Machlokes here could be if a moving crate blocks tumah or not. Okay, next problem though is how do you put the truma down on the grave? You metame the truma, you make the truma tamei. It's an issur d'oraisa to make truma tamei by placing it on the grave. So how could you place it there? So Gemara says, so we're talking about where the truma was not huchshar to be a makabel tuma. That means it never became wet. If it's a loaf of bread, it just means that it never became wet with one of the special liquids, the 7 special liquids which make foods susceptible to tuma. Fruit juice is not one of them, so it must have been kneaded with fruit juice, and therefore it can never become tamei, and that's why you're allowed to place it on the grave. It is not makabel tumah until it becomes wet. The Gemara says, okay, fine, I understand, but when the kohen picks up the tumah, when the kohen picks up the truma, he's going to have to be using some kind of a kli, some kind of a device to collect it. So how does he hold it? That device will be on top of a grave, and the halacha is that anything which is over a grave is mikabel tumah from tumas ohel, and it's also metame the person that's holding it. So the kohen becomes tamei through that thing that he's holding, even if he's inside the box. So Gemara says we're talking about where it's a straight, flat wooden kli. It has no concave shape to hold things. It's made out of wood, and it's called pshute kliyates, and those things are not mikabel tumah. They can never become tamei, therefore they don't bring tumah to the person itself. The Gemara says, but they could still bring tumah, even if they themselves don't become tumah, but they are an ohel. And halacha, somebody who's holding an ohel becomes tamei, even if the ohel itself is not tamei. So, how are you going to get around that? The Gemara says, he's holding it in such a way that it is not spread a tefach wide over the grave. If it's a wide kli, like a frying pan or something, or a flat pan, so he's holding it sideways, on its edge. And he's got the food kind of held on the edge like that, because that way there's no tefach surface spread horizontally over the grave, and therefore there's no oel, and it cannot be metame him from holding it unless it itself becomes tamei, and it itself doesn't become tamei because it's a flat piece of wood. Okay, the Gemara says, if that's true, so then why would the Rabbanan say that it's forbidden? If it's a solitary grave, and the kohen can arrive there without stepping on any graves, then what's the problem? He could hold it in a kli without having a oel, which is not makabel tumah. What's the issue? So Gemara says, The Chachamim's issue has nothing to do with Tumah at all. The issue is something else. You're placing your Erev on top of a grave. And remember, the way an Erev works is by establishing this spot as your permanent residence for Shabbos. They say you can't make a residence on top of a grave. You're not allowed to live on a grave. That's Isurei Hana. A grave is Isur Hana. It's forbidden for a person to use, and therefore you cannot set up your home there. That's the problem. The whole Kohen thing is not the point. The Truma thing is not the point. The point is that it's on a grave. So the Gemara says, so what does Rabbi Yehuda hold? The Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda says that an Erev is only allowed to be used for a mitzvah. You only have to set up an Erev Tchumen in order to be able to travel somewhere for the purpose of accomplishing a mitzvah. Therefore, the only function of this is a mitzvah. We have a rule, mitzvahs lav lehonis nitnu. Doing a mitzvah doesn't count as a hana. It's not a hana to do a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to do a mitzvah. Therefore, it's not a violation of the Isser hana on a grave to set up your Erev there. It's all a mitzvah. So Gemara says, well, hold on a second. The concept of mitzvahs lav lehonis nitnu is a mitzvah considered a hana or not is a statement of Rava. And according to this, that's the machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda says that a mitzvah is not a hana, and the Chachamim seem to say that it is a hana, therefore you're not allowed to set up an Erev on a grave. Gemara says, Rava will tell you, no, everybody, they both agree that a mitzvah is not a hana. The question over here is, are you allowed to use an Erev for non-mitzvah? According to the Chachamim, you could set it up for a non-mitzvah, and therefore don't tell me that, oh, it's a mitzvah, it's not a hana. You may use it because you decide you want to go visit your grandmother. Okay, maybe that's also a mitzvah. But it's not you could use it just to go get food, whatever it is. It's not a actual mitzvah. It does not have to be used for a mitzvah, and therefore you cannot tell me mitzvah slav lehonis nitnu, therefore I'm allowed to set it up in a place which is Isser Hana. So Gemara says, well, hold on a second. The question of whether or not you can use an Erev for non-mitzvah is the statement of Rav Yosef. He says that you can't. Now that has become a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. So what Rabbi Yosef said is a machlokes Tanaim. How could he say something which is subject to a machlokes Tanaim? So when it says Rabbi Yosef will tell you, no, really everybody agrees that really mitzvah is not a hana, and everybody agrees you're only allowed to use a erev for a mitzvah. The question here is as follows: the mitzvah is when you set up the erev. The instant you set up the erev, that's the mitzvah. Now afterwards, do you still need your erev to stay there? If you want your erev to stay there afterwards, that's because you want to come eat it at some point. That's not the erev. That's the place guarding your food. That's not a mitzvah. That's your own private hana, and that is the machlekes. Do we say that people want the place to guard their food so that they can come eat it, and therefore it's not necessarily a mitzvah and you can't set it up on a grave? Or do we say, no, they don't care once the erev is set up, they don't care about the food anymore, and therefore there is no personal hana? Okay, that takes us to the end of this discussion. We get to the Mishnah now, and this Mishnah and the Gemara's discussion that follows is a repeat of the Gemara we had already in Brachos and in Shabbos. It's going to come up again in Pesachim and in Beitza, so it appears in many of the first few Masechtas. Gemara lists a number of different foods with halachic status and whether you're allowed to use them or not. The general rule is if you're allowed to eat them, you're allowed to use them. As an erev, if they're forbidden for everybody to eat, then it's no good for an erev. So the list here is as follows: Demai, you're allowed to use Meiser Rishon that had its truma taken off, and Meiser Sheni or Hektish that was redeemed, you're allowed to use. Kohanim are allowed to use Challah. Now, Tevel, which is food that did not have its truma or Meiser taken, you're not allowed to use. Meiser Rishon that was taken, food Meiser Rishon that did not have its Trumas Meiser taken off, which is the Truma has to be given to the Kohen from the Meiser, which belongs to the Levi, that's also Tevel, so that's also no good. And Meiser Sheni or Hektish, which has not been redeemed, all these things you cannot use. The Gemara is going to ask that some of these seem untrue and most of these seem Pashut. So the Gemara goes through them one by one, and again, this is a repeat of the Sugya. The Gemara says, Demai, first of all, you can't eat Demai. Why should you be allowed to make an erev with it? The Gemara says you can, because you can make it accessible to yourself. If you abandon all your belongings and you become poor, a poor person's allowed to eat Demai, like we have a Mishnah that says you're allowed to feed Demai to the poor and to the soldiers which are quartered in your house by the king. These are Jewish soldiers, and they count as poor. Now, says Rav Huna that is machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel says you're allowed to, and Beis Shammai says you're not allowed to feed it to them. Okay. Next on the list is Meiser Rishon that did not have truma taken Meiser Rishon that did have a truma taken from it, that is permitted. The Gemara says, of course it is. What's wrong with it? It's perfectly fine. The Gemara says, we're talking about a situation where the Levi went to the field and he took his Meiser Rishon before the grain was ever harvested. He took his portion then, and no truma was therefore ever taken from it. Truma Gedolah is supposed to be taken before Meiser Rishon. That's the part that goes to the Kohen. It's supposed to be separated before the Levi takes his part. And here the Levi took his part first, and therefore there was never any truma taken from this. And it's okay because there's halacha that you only have to take truma from the grain. Like it says, the Levi has to give trumas meiser from his meiser. He does not have to give Meiser Gedolah, the original Meiser that's supposed to go to the Kohen from the Yisrael, that he doesn't have to give. So if it wasn't taken before he got his share, it does not have to be taken anymore. So Gemara says that Rav Papa Abaye, that's a very good source. How come it's only if he took it while it was still standing grain before it was harvested? That source is so good that even if it was harvested already and it's heaped in a pile of grain, he should be able to, if he came and he took his portion first, he shouldn't have to give Truma Gedolah afterwards. How come there he does? So he answered because there's a different pasuk that says, no, Mikol Maser Yisechem Trimu, you have to give from everything, even if the Levi came and took first. So the Gemara says, all right, so how do you know that the one that says, the pasuk that says he has to give Truma Gedolah from his Meiser is referring to where it was grain, and the one that says where it does not have to give is referring to where it was standing stalks? How do you know which one's which? So the Gemara says because the obligation to give Truma Gedolah only falls on harvested grain, doesn't fall on growing grain, and therefore it's not called grain. The Meiser de Gancha doesn't apply until it's harvested. And therefore, once it's harvested, now the obligation to give Truma Gedolah applies. Then the Levi comes and takes his share first. That obligation has not been resolved. He still has to give it. If, however, he took his Truma, he took his Meiser before it was ever harvested, before there was ever an obligation on him, on anybody or on this grain to have Truma taken from it, then it's circumvented and blocked and never comes on and applies. Okay, next thing in the Mishnah was Meiser Sheni and Hekesh that has been redeemed. Again, the Gemara says this is obvious. What's the problem? It's been redeemed. The Gemara says it was redeemed. It wasn't redeemed properly. You didn't take off the Chaimish, the extra fifth. When you redeem something, you're supposed to add a fifth of the value, which is really a fourth of the value, and a fifth of the total after the adding. This is to teach you that it's still redeemed and the redemption works even though he didn't add the fifth. Next, he's not allowed to use a tevel, grain that has not had its truma or meiser separated. The Gemara says that's obvious. Where it says where it was only obligated in truma midrabanan, like it was in a flower pot that has no hole, and the only midrabanan is that obligated in truma in the first place. Okay, next, you're not allowed to use meiser rishon which did not have its truma taken off. So the verse says, of course not. It didn't have its truma to take it off its tevel. Why should you be allowed to? So the verse says, no, this is talking about the Truma Gedolah, and again it's where the Levi grabbed his meiser first, but here he grabbed it from the already harvested and threshed grain. He didn't grab it from the stalks. And you might think, like Rav Papa asked his question, that I still have a pasuk that tells me that he's not obligated, and the Mishnah comes to teach me, no, like Abaye's answer, he is obligated because the obligation already applied before he took his meiser before that. Okay, next thing is you're not allowed to use Meiser Sheni or Hekdesh that was not redeemed. Gemara says again, it's obvious. Gemara says no, we're referring to where it was redeemed, but it was redeemed too improperly to be used. It was redeemed using a coin that doesn't have a face, and the halacha is V'tzarta HaKesef, like it says. V'tzarta HaKesef has to be a coin that has a face upon it, and therefore it's not rubbed out. Or he redeemed it on land, ground, and we know that you can't redeem Meiser Sheni or Hekdesh with land. You gotta use coins or movable objects. Okay, that takes us to the next Mishnah, which discusses who are you allowed to send an Eruv with. Who can you trust to set up the Eruv properly? So the Gemara says, if you send it with somebody who does not have proper intelligence, such as a Chereshayta or a Katan, the deaf, who in those days couldn't learn, and somebody who is not functional, and somebody who is a child, so then you can't trust them that it was set up, and it's no good. You send it with somebody who doesn't hold of an Eruv. Eruv is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. Somebody who doesn't hold of an Eruv, like some Kusi, Tzeduki, or something like that. So you can't trust him either. In all these cases, however, if you have somebody at the other end who's there waiting, and that person is going to take it from these untrustworthy people's hand and establish the Erev for you, then, and this person is trustworthy, then you can rely on it. So Gemara says, first of all, why can't you trust a katan? We have a statement of Rav Huna that says that a katan is allowed to go around when you want to set up an Erev Chatzeres. He's allowed to collect a piece of bread from all the houses so that they can set up their permanent residence in one of the houses. The Gemara says that's different. That's Erev Chatzeres. Here we're talking about Erev Tchumen. Erev Tchumen, you have to actually make your house. Erev Chatzeres, you just have to send a piece of bread and have an interest. Here you have to actually set this up as your house. Somebody has to do that for you. You can't just have somebody collect a piece of bread from you. Okay, who's the one who doesn't hold of an Erev? Rav Chisda says a Kusi. Next, the Mishnah had said that if you have somebody there waiting at the other end to receive the Erev and set it up for you, then it's okay. The Gemara says, well, how do you know whoever got it? Maybe the Katan or the Kusi or whoever it is lost it along the way and he never delivered it, so how could you rely on it? The Gemara says it's referring to where you were able to watch him the entire way and you see that he brought it. You just couldn't see what happened that far away. You can assume that he did it properly. That was Rav Chisda. And the Gemara says, but how do you know that you can trust that the person that said he will set it up for you, that he took it from the guy's hand? You can't see what's happening. The Gemara says, it's a rule. Chazak al shliach oiseh shlichusa. This is a rule of Rav Yechiel. If you make somebody a messenger to do something for you, you could assume he did it properly. Now the Gemara says, where is this back and forth between Rav Chisda and Rav Yechiel said? You can assume a shliach did his job correctly. It wasn't said in this case. When it says it was said about sending an Erev with a trained monkey or elephant. If you put the Erev on them, you train them to go to the guy. And again, we ask, how do you know he got there? And we answer that we watched him go the whole way. And we assume that the guy took it off his hand. Rav Chisda says, how do you know? And Rav Yechiel answers, because you can trust him, that a shliach will do his mission. The Gemara will ask on this, but that will be on Daf Lamed.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.